do a variety of things. We have some courses in June usually in collaboration with the University of Michigan. We do these 1-week courses. We do some seminars during the year. We do presentations like this, and we're hoping this will be one of the series on large representative data sets that to let people know about them and hopefully use it in their research. We do also consulting to graduate students and faculty. So we have this methodology piece as well. So if you go to our website, and it's going to be the last slide that you have on your handout, has the Center for Research on Families website, you'll be able to see all the different kinds of things we do. So this presentation today is part of the methodology group's attempt to let people know about large data sets that are out there that are nationally representative and that also contain lots of different kinds of variables for people in different disciplines to be able to think about using. So what we're hoping to do today is very informational. We're hoping to introduce you to the data, talk a little bit about it, and then have a couple of faculty here at the UMass campus who have used it, talk about their experience with it, and if anyone in the audience has had some experience, we'd like to hear about that as well. And then hopefully at the end, we'll see if there's any interest in forming a users group to continue this effort. So the person that's going to talk to you the most about this is Tina Chen. Let me introduce her. Tina Chen is a graduate student in cognitive psychology here at UMass, and she also works for the Statistical Consulting Division of Center for Research on Families. And she went to an AdHealth Users Conference a couple of days this summer in Washington to learn about the data set, to find out what people were doing, and then came back here and is going to present some of the information generally about the data set. So I will let Tina take over at this point, but just wanted to welcome you all. Please feel free to get up and get coffee and cookies during it. This is meant to be pretty informal. And I'll just kill this light. Here we go.
So welcome and thank you for coming out to hear about AdHealth, which is what we're calling a data goldmine for interdisciplinary research. It's a really large data set, and so we want to talk a little bit about what's in it and how this can be helpful for you. So just for an outline for what we're going to be covering today, you'll see this on your handout as well. I'll start off talking about why large data sets are beneficial in general, what they can provide in addition to the work that you might already be doing. Then I'll go into what AdHealth is, just generally what the history of it was, why it started, and then into the sampling design. So it is a little bit complicated with the sampling, so I'm going to take some time stepping through that. Then we'll talk a little bit about what kinds of variables are in AdHealth, but there are a lot of variables in AdHealth, so I'm not going to be able to cover all of them. And then after that, I will talk about how AdHealth has been used historically, I guess, and what research has been done using AdHealth. And this is really, I'll be drawing on some talks that I went to at this conference that Amy mentioned. And then we will have a couple faculty from UMass present on their work. So Tony Tack will be presenting on his work. He's in the sociology department. And Krista Guile will also be presenting on her work. She's from the statistics department. And then after we hear about how AdHealth has been used, we'll talk a little bit about how AdHealth can be accessed. And we'll maybe show you some of the actual website that you can go to access some of the data. All right, so let me just go ahead and talk about how or why large data sets are beneficial generally. So we're hoping that this will be the first in a series of workshops offered by the Center for Research on Families on large data sets. And we're really interested in talking about large data sets and presenting this to people because there are a lot of advantages of large data sets over collecting data that you might do in your own particular lab. So for example, having a large data set gives you greater statistical power. So you're able to have more confidence in the conclusions that you draw. It's also not as time consuming when you can just go ahead and access the data that's already been collected in a time consuming manner that you don't have to waste your time going out and getting that data. It's also relatively inexpensive, so when you have to collect data, and especially if you want a lot of data, longitudinal data, it's going to add up. Getting participants to come back and all of that is just really going to be a toll on your resources. And so having the data set already collected for you will alleviate a little bit of that. Also having access to a large data set and analyzing it really increases your generalizability. So when you have data sets that are smaller, you can make your inferences about the data set and what you want to generalize to, but when you have it nationally representative, you can really have a lot more confidence in saying this is representative of the entire United States, for example. And one great thing about having large data sets is that it does put the individual in a context. So it will get some information about networks or where that individual is in terms of their neighborhood or their county or something like that. And so you can see the role that their neighborhood plays, or their context plays in the individual and whatever behavior or outcomes that you're looking at. So this is why we're interested in large data sets and presenting about them. And so for today, we're going to talk about specifically AdHealth. So what is AdHealth? This is their lovely logo over there. So the official name of AdHealth is the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health. This is actually a little bit different. So they changed the name officially this summer. Before it was just the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. And the study originated because it was in response to a congressional mandate to fund a study on adolescent health. So their original focus was really to look at the individual in context and really focus on health and health-related behaviors from adolescence through young adulthood. But as the study has sort of emerged and continued, they've sort of generalized just to adulthood. We moved past the young adulthood and we're now just in adulthood. So the study is, as we've mentioned, large. So there are over 20,000 individuals in the data set, which is much larger than my usual experiments of 25. It's also nationally representative, and I'll go into the sampling design a little bit more and how it's nationally representative, but it does draw samples throughout the nation. It's also longitudinal, so there are currently 4 wave points, time points. So the first wave was collected around 1994, the next in 1996, the third was in 2001, and the fourth in 2008. And they are planning a 5th wave, which will start data collection in 2015. So wave 1 included students from 7th through 12th grade, so really getting adolescents, and as they followed them through time, as they get older into adulthood as well. But this is an ongoing study, so the 5th wave is starting data collection next year. The individuals will be adults in their 30s or so. So the study is funded by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and also 23 other federal agencies and foundations, because as you can imagine, this is a really expensive study to collect data on, and so they do have a lot of funding. And it is currently hosted by the Carolina Population Center, so if you're interested and you have your laptop, you can go ahead and go to the website, which I linked you'll see the link to it at the bottom of the screen, or you can just Google AdHealth to find it. And there's a lot of information on the website, and so a lot of this information that I'm presenting today is drawn from the website in addition to what I learned from going to the conference specifically. Alright, so I'm going to jump into the sampling structure because it gives you an idea of what kind of individuals are in the data set that might be of relevance to you. And this does get a little bit complicated. So we've got this figure, and when I first saw this, I thought I would never be able to understand what it means, but hopefully I'll be able to break it down for you to understand. So you'll see up here, we've got a school sampling frame. And basically this just means that the people who are organizing AdHealth, where they had access to every high school in the nation. They got a list of all the high schools. And from that list of all the high schools in the nation, they pulled out some high schools in particular for their sample. And because they're looking at grades 7 through 12, they need to maybe get some middle schools, just to really get some graders as well as the high school students. So for each high school that they sampled, they would find a single feeder school that would eventually lead into that high school, and they consider this to be a single community. And that was their general frame there. So from the high schools, they had this huge sampling frame of adolescents and their parents, because they did interview parents as well. The total, and here's more than 100,000 that they were actually sampling from. And so you'll see here it says 100 to 4,000 per pair of schools meaning high school and feeder. So that means that these schools ranged in size from 100 students to 4,000 students. So you do have a wide range of school sizes here. So interviews were then conducted sampling from here. So interviews were conducted in school. They actually went to the schools and asked the administrators to actually administer these, or the administrators didn't administer the interview. They went to the administrators and had permission to interview in school. And they also went to some individuals' homes to actually also interview them as well. Now, I draw your attention, to the main sample here. So what they did here is they got 200 per community. So what that means is that for each high school feeder community, they stratified the sample by grade, so 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, etc., and by sex, so that they could get a proportional sample dependent on those stratifications. So they got around 200 per community, and that is the main sample. But in addition to having this main sample, they had some that were oversampled. So we have some ethnic samples, for example, that were oversampled. So they had a lot more higher education Black, Puerto Rican, Chinese, and Cuban individuals than you would normally find proportionally in the population. But they did want to oversample that so that they could get more of those. And we also have an oversample of disabled individuals, and specifically this is physical disability. In addition, we have some saturation samples. So from 16 of these 80 schools that they got in the general sampling frame, 16 of them were saturated. So they interviewed every single individual in that school. In addition, we also have genetic samples. So if there were any twins that they sampled, they automatically had their twin also sampled. We also have genetic information, or we have information about full siblings, half siblings, and unrelated pairs who are in the same household. So that's the sampling structure there. Hopefully I broke that down enough for you to get a sense of how that was done. It was sort of complicated, but it does give us a good picture of what's naturally representative, but also getting some more information about some samples that we want to look into more. In addition to getting these data from the interview at Wave 1, they also included the physical and social context. So what I mean by this was they merged in some existing data. Specifically, they merged in data from the census. They merged in data from STD prevalence that they got those statistics from the CDC, FBI crime statistics, information from the National Center for Health Statistics, and National Council of Churches information, which I believe is in terms of number of churches in their community. And so this information they do have in the original data set is geocoded, so that's how they were able to merge the existing data with data for these individuals. But in terms of the access that a researcher might have, that geocode information is not available. So they do have this merged in, but if you wanted to know where exactly, or if you want to know more than what they have there for a particular context, it's a little bit more difficult to get that. In addition to the existing data, they did have some ancillary studies that they also merged in. So they have, for example, the ONE database, which is the Obesity and Neighborhood Environment database, which includes things like how many parks are in your area and other things that might be related to obesity in terms of the neighborhood. They also included information from the Adolescent Health and Academic Achievement Study. So in addition to the interviews and merging in the existing data, they also had some questionnaire-based information that gives a little bit more about the context, specifically social context. So individuals nominated their friends and nominated their peers to indicate what their kind of network was. So they got in-school and at-home or in-home friendship nominations and network data included in Wave 1. And also some family context. So as I mentioned, there were parents who were also interviewed in addition to the individuals. So they do have some context of, for example, what their mother thinks about certain things. So that is all at Wave 1, but as I mentioned, this is longitudinal. They do have a wave. So waves 2 through 4, I will summarize very briefly. So in Wave 2, which was collected about 2 years after Wave 1 was collected, this was just an in-home interview. So they had 14,748 students interviewed for Wave 2. And this is lower than the 20,000, not just because of attrition, but because seniors from Wave 1 were not followed up on because of cost at the time. But since then, they've gained more money, so they're able to follow up on individuals more thoroughly now. In Wave 3, which was 2001 to 2002, the individuals were around 18 to 26 years old, so this is the young adulthood era. And they had 15,197 participants in this wave. This wave is particularly interesting because they also got romantic pairs data. So 1,507 partners were also interviewed. These partners included those who were married to the individual, cohabiting, or just dating the individual. So there is access to romantic pairs data, but I'll talk about this a little bit at the end, but it's a little bit separate from the general data. So the most recent wave that's been collected is wave 4, which was done in 2008 and 2009. So now our adults are 24 to 32 years old, and we have 15,701 participants in this wave. And what's unique about this wave is they really introduced a lot of biomarker data. So they have genetic information and all kinds of things like metabolism and immune function information that they collected at wave 4. And wave 5, as I mentioned, is upcoming. So their goal is to have data collection in 2015, 2018, and then the data will be accessible to researchers after. So what kinds of variables are included in ad health? Well, there are around 10,000 variables, so obviously I won't be able to go through all of them. But I did want to highlight sort of the general categories of variables that they do have. So they have information about family, siblings, and friends, education, work, military, physical and mental health, information about daily activities and sleep, information about relationships, sexual and fertility histories, whether the individual has had substance use experience, delinquency and violence, or involvement with the criminal justice system, their attitudes, particularly with religion, economics and expectations, meaning do you have a job, or what are your expectations about getting a job? There's also measures of psychological and personality behavior, psychology and personality. Also information about children and parenting, civic participation, gambling, mentoring, cognitive function, and as I mentioned, biological measures. So this includes cardiovascular, immune function, genetic data, and so on. So this is sort of just the highlights version of what they have, but obviously they have a lot more happening here with the variables. So how has ad health been used? So this information is as of the conference that I went to, so this is in June of this year. So as of June, the data had been made available to over 10,000 investigators, and 650 grants have been awarded to analyze ad health. Over 2,000 peer-reviewed publications have now been published. And in addition to that, there are 20 books, 100 reports, and 80 book chapters out there, and 500 master's theses and doctoral dissertations. And it's been used in all kinds of fields. I've just listed some of them, so biology and economics, education, physiology, medicine, nutrition, psychology, public health, sociology, statistics, but this is not an exhaustive list. And I did have a link at the bottom for publication, so I'll just go ahead and jump to that so you can see that. But in short, you can actually go onto the website and find all the publications that they have linked there. So we have a link, this is the website. If you click on publications here, you'll see that it's got a search function for all the publications that you might be interested in looking at that have used ad health. And I believe it says there are almost 5,000 publications and presentations and so on in the bibliography. So this is something you might want to look through to see if what has been done currently in your field using ad health. So that's sort of a broad picture. So I do want to focus in a little bit more about what research has been done using ad health and really focus in on particular studies. So I'll talk about two that I heard at this conference. And I do apologize if you want to know a lot more details than I present because I'm sort of relying on memory and sort of fuzzy notes. So this is sort of an overall flavor of what was happening, what kind of research has been done. So the first study that I will be presenting was asking how does socialization and personality influence romantic relationship quality in young adulthood. So this is based on the development of early adult romantic relationship model, which posits that socialization, specifically the parent-child relationship, and personality, specifically neuroticism, as measured by the Big Five, are really influential in how young adults form their romantic relationships and how that quality plays out. But the previously analyzed data that this researcher mentioned really sort of includes only 451 rural white families, which is not exactly representative. So they're really interested in looking at a nationally representative sample. So expanding to other ethnicities, expanding to other urban or whatever types of communities. And in addition to expanding to a nationally representative sample, they're interested in looking at other personality traits as well because they believe that neuroticism is not necessarily the only predictor here of in terms of personality traits. So the predictors that they looked at specifically were at wave 1. So they looked at personality, included all of the big 5 personality traits. And they also looked at family of origin influences, so that parent-child socialization influence. Specifically, they're looking at communication with parents and affection in the parental relationship. And they're interested in the outcome of romantic relationship quality, as measured by satisfaction and the partner's affection. They included a lot of controls, which I didn't get time to jot down in my notes, but they did control for a lot of things. And their general conclusion is that both socialization and personality predict relationship quality and a nationally representative sample. So they found corroborating evidence in this representative sample, as with the 451 rural white families, and they also found that it wasn't just neuroticism that mattered. The next study that I will be presenting was looking at a different topic. So their question was, are differences in diabetes diagnoses in young adults due to differences in help seeking or in diagnosis allocation? So in particular, there is a model, Anderson's behavioral model of health services use, which posits that diagnosis differences are based on differences in help seeking as well as differences in diagnostic screening. So there's also, however, historical mistreatment by race. So healthcare use may be higher among whites. That might be due to a few reasons. So it's unclear whether we're looking at help-seeking differences or diagnostic screening differences when it comes to race. So the predictors that they included here were race or ethnic groups. And in particular, their outcome variables were a recent doctor visit within the last 3 months and whether or not they were diagnosed with diabetes. They had a lot of control variables, which again, I didn't really write down all of them, but generally they were variables that would presumably reduce doctor seeking. So what they found is that there was no differential help seeking by race or ethnicity. So whites and blacks were equally likely to seek help, but blacks were 5 times more likely to have missed diabetes diagnosis, even when they did go to the doctor recently. So it did seem that by race there was an effect of diagnostic screening, that there was a difference in the diagnosis for blacks specifically. All right, so that's sort of just a flavor of what research has been done. There are a couple other slides in here that talk about other talks that I went to, which you can look at in your own time, but we do want to introduce Tony Peck's study, or his research. So he'll talk a little bit about what he's been doing here at UMass.
So Tony is a faculty member in sociology here at UMass, a recent member from our faculty in January. So welcome.
Thank you for inviting me. So I just started in January 2014, and I'll try to speak louder. And I was at the University of Iowa for about 10 years, and while there I had actually had 2 contracts. One was a restricted version, which included the mental health data, which basically I could access, but I also had a restricted version of the data set that I had my students as well as my colleagues to use. So I'm in the process of transferring that data over here now currently, so I can that's currently in the administration center. So what I'd like to do today is talk about some of my studies and highlight how what slices of data I took in Ad Health and what I did with that. Ad Health is quite large, and there's a lot of startup costs in terms of trying to get a sense of how the data were organized. I'll try to give you a flavor of what I did. So, first 2 studies I want to talk about are social network studies. And as Tina pointed out, one of the nice features of that health compared to a lot of data sets is that we gather social network data in grade 1 and particularly in schools. So in the in-school sample, they had approximately 90,000 students nominating their friends. A subsample of those, about 20,000 of them were interviewed in home. So not everyone who's in the school sample made it into the home sample, except for the sexually saturated sample. So 16 schools, they interviewed everyone in the home and in school. So let me talk about the first study. So, so the first study basically are looking at some of the social network data that were gathered in schools. So we have in-school nominations, and we have measures of some delinquency, in this case fighting, that was also measured in school. And what we're interested in was looking at whether or not adolescents embedded in networks that were fighting networks had a greater propensity for committing IPV than Wave 3. So this paper was published in the Journal of Adolescent Health with my former student Ken Sanchudin, colleague Ken Heimer, and who's in sociology, and Marison Ramirez, who's also a former colleague in public health at Iowa. And so what was the unique feature of this particular analysis is that the measures of fighting with the network are based on the friends' own reports, and that's one of the strengths of the analysis, is that we can rely not necessarily on respondents' projections of what they think the friends are doing, but actually draw on what the friends are actually reporting in their own responses to the survey. So what we show is that that risk of IPV perpetration by boys, or I should say by young men, is related to different kinds of network structures that were gathered in grade 1. This is another paper that's currently under review at Human Society, also with my former student Ken Sanchudin and Ken Heimer, my former colleague. And so what we're doing here is we're kind of trying to do a little bit more with the network data. And so here we're focusing on the 16 saturated schools. So what's unique about this data set, or this subsample of the overall sample, is that every respondent in school was also, they also tried to enroll them in a home interview. And so we have their network responses at Wave 1, but also Wave 2. So they asked friendship questions at both waves. So here we're actually able to look at the network over time, which is very rare in network studies. What we do here is we're looking at whether or not peer delinquency is more likely to make the respondent more delinquent over time, depending upon whether or not the peer network has become more delinquent or not. And what we find out is that the effects are gender specific. So again, the key feature that we drew out of here is that we're using complete social network data for reporting the health data, but also the longitudinal social network data, which is extremely rare to get at. Right, so I have also a couple papers on husband partnerships. So this is a paper I published. It's actually the first paper I started working on. My first ad-hoc study. I'm embarrassed to say I started in 2006. It was a long process. But eventually found a home. But I think it's an interesting study. So this is a study on relationship building behaviors based on Wave 2. So Wave 1 and Wave 2, the adult data asked respondents, the survey asked respondents about their 3 most romantic relationships and the 3 most non-romantic relationships. And one of the questions they did ask, or set of questions they did ask respondents, was what the adolescents did in those relationships specifically. And so people have used that data to generate national estimates of relationship building behaviors that adolescents engage in when they form their intimate and sexual relationships. So what I did was I looked at the kinds of behaviors that occurred or sexual activity. And so here are some of the activities that could include adolescents who are going in groups, go out through alone, partner's parent, disclose couplehood, see lots of friends, exchange presents, tell each other I love you. So these are generally, I only looked at the ones that occurred before sexual activity. And then these are all dichotomous, so I ran a label mixture model, or label class model to pull the basic classes that representative of all relationship and behavior in the United States. So I found 4 classes. So the minimal class, what I call the minimal class, has low proportions of going out in groups, a little over 20%. Less than 10% say they go out together alone. 50% they meet their partner's parents. 11% say they disclose a couple, etc. So that gives you a kind of a style of relationship building that's kind of close to a hookup, right? Was the logic. So that was pretty interesting study to engage in. Another study I did with Kelly Stuber, also at Iowa in the Department of Communications, communication studies there. So we were looking at some of the Wave3 cohabitors. So Tina mentioned that there was partner data, Wave3 on cohabitors and married couples and daters, but we didn't look at necessarily those partner data. We're just looking at cohabitors because a ton of them. There's about 900 cohabitors in Wave3, and we're looking at financial arrangements in terms of whether or not they have joint banking and relationship quality, and just using simple LS model. So one of the things I'm going to stress here is that you actually have compared to a lot of data sets and a lot of collaborators in the data, and in this case current collaborators, which is very rare. Lastly, I want to talk about life course paper that we're looking at now with Ken and Karen again. And here we're using Wave3 data again, looking at 2 outcomes, non-marital pregnancy, which is self-reported, and then we're also looking at sort of biomarker data, which is HPV. So in Wave3, they collected STI data for some of the respondents, and then for such that women, they took a random sample of them and graded them into an HPV sample. So this is nationally representative of such active women in Wave3. And what I was looking at was whether or not absence pledging, which is what we have put in Wave 1, was associated with increased likelihoods of HPV acquisition, contingent or dependent on the number of the non-sexual activity. Because there's some debate about, well, basically what happened is researchers were surprised that there wasn't much of an association between pledging and health outcomes. And one of the reasons why is the effect is kind of complex. And so here's teasing out that pledgers are actually at increased risk for HPV as the amount of sexual activity goes on. That's it.
Thank you, Tony. And I think people will have probably questions too. I don't know if Krista came here. Is Krista here? She's going to come to quarter. So why don't we see if there's a couple of questions? The other person's going to talk to Gal. She had another meeting and isn't going to be able to get here till about quarter hour. So maybe people can have questions about. Yeah.
Let me ask a couple. Just 2 questions. I guess one is, like, at least actually have to do with the curious about the research too, but since we are talking about data, the first one is, I guess, especially given the revisions you've had and at least the way you would think as a sociologist in terms of the timing of transition to adulthood, how it's dramatically changed since the recession. Has the timing of this data set, the fact that Wave 1 is in the mid-90s, has that ever been an issue? I've just as an analogy, I've heard say people who do the Wisconsin longitudinal survey are sort of defensive about the fact that it's really only white Americans, but they track up, great data, of course, just like this. But I'm wondering, is that an issue when you try to get this and disseminate analyses? And the other question has to do with the school sample. Is there an attempt by the ad health researchers to make that subset nationally representative, or at least theoretically distributed in a way that it's somehow generalizable? I mean, how do you write about that sample if it isn't
Right, okay, so the first question is, are the data too old, particularly using the earlier samples, which in some of the cases I'm looking at like wave 1 and wave 2 only. Admittedly, that paper that was published in 2012 had started in 2006. So I've never had a negative review say these data are too old, looking at these earlier waves, particularly network stuff because it's so rare. But also in my discipline, we have people publishing off supplies and that's. So that is an issue with respect to the earlier wave stuff. And so, like right now, I'm waiting for wave 5, which I intend to jump on to try to get basically new data and new variables that no one else has touched. Whereas if you use the older stuff, it's harder to kind of come up with questions because they can kind of break over very well. Less than probably wave 3 and 4. And then the second question was
The 16 saturated schools. How do you describe them if they're not? Are they not representative? If not, then how do you? What are they? Have they done anything with the data? How do these make it distributed in a way that represents a big school, small schools, urban, rural, or?
they did try to kind of have some big schools and some small schools, but there's in no way is that representative.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yes.
What type, thinking about like, what kinds of data are repeatedly asked across the line?
Did everybody hear that?
No.
Back? Yes, why don't you speak up?
Sorry, yeah, no, I'm just noticing that the types of questions asked at wave 1 seem different from subsequent waves. So, what kind of repeated things?
What are the repeated questions?
Or topic areas?
Well, I would say that, certainly something like progression is asked in each way, and they always ask about partnerships in each way. But that's not like a really complete measurement kind of situation in some cases, right? So, in my second network paper, which is a fixed effects model, I did use the same questions, which were network questions, which are actually quite rare to have all the time. But off the top of my head, I can't tell you exactly which items are creating, which items are creating week 3 or week 4 that were asked in prior weeks. But something like the question that would show up.
Did you get any sense of that, Tina?
There was in the original presentation that they showed in June, which I can't remember exactly. I think my recollection of that was that they basically just kept adding stuff as opposed to like sort of wave 1. So they did have quite a bit at wave 1, but there's some things that weren't really relevant. So like economic expectations, not really relevant in wave 1, but they added that later. But there are things like substance use, I believe, and like other things that I guess were sort of surprising to me at wave 1. So they did have quite a bit at wave 1. I want to say, so they were really looking at mostly physical health. So those variables that they thought were related to that were included in wave 1. There, I think if you actually go onto the website, you can actually pull up the original, or not the original, but the introduction PowerPoint that was presented at the users conference in June. And they actually have a nice slide that says wave 1 here are general variables, wave 2 here are some variables, here's what we added, etc. And I can like send you that specifically later to show you where to do that.
Is there ever more than one reporter, like parents and children ever report, or is it just the respondent?
Yeah, so they did have parents for some of the individuals, yeah. Particularly on wave 1, but also like different, like so you have like the Magic Pears in wave 3, etc. So they also had school administrators report for wave 1 and wave 2, I believe.
They geocode for each census, so I would imagine wave 1 is closest to the 1990 census, and then
Yeah.
do you know if they geocode for?
I was trying to look that up. As far as I can tell, it's for wave 1. I don't know if you know if they included.
Contextual variables.
Yeah.
There are contextual variables for each way, is my understanding. And there are geocodes available in the secure archive. You have to go there to look at those. So if you do actually look at real geocodes, you could go to this all kinds of population science there for first variables.
Is there a special funding mechanism for ad health data, or is it you can apply to any institute? I mean, so are there special calls to use the ad health data to do X, Y, or Z, or no?
You know, I have not seen anything specific to that health. Obviously, there's R3 mechanism and SHD.
Right.
That is arguably the lines.
So we'll have Krista Guile present on her work in this discipline.
Jeff is bringing it over here, Krista. So Krista, over here. You know,
Thank you. So Krista's from the statistics department here at UMass, also an ad health user, and we just thought it would be good to have people, sort of a little variety here from different disciplines to sort of show the spread of this. She's going to hook up her thing, and we're going to hope it works.
It should. You know, I got out of the car this morning and I was walking to my office, and my bag tipped upside down and my laptop fell on the pavement.
Wow.
But I tested it, it seemed to work, so it should work.
Okay, and do you remember, Carla, did you say we don't have to restart this?
No, you shouldn't.
We just switched laptops.
It looks like you know
It's thinking, okay, it's thinking and syncing. So while Chris is setting up, just to say, just to say that we're going to talk a little bit at the end about accessing the data set. And I think one of the questions that'll come up that I hope both of them can address has to do with the restricted versus the public use data set. Because I know people are interested in that.
Okay. So, so my research using ad hoc has been from a more, oh cute. Has been from a more methodological perspective. So I'll just talk with you about some of what I did, and then, or what I've done with the ad hoc data, and hopefully it gives you a sense of what some of the data might be like. So I'm a statistician. I started working with the ad hoc data as a grad student at the University of Washington. So, and this is the beginning, so I don't actually know that much about the structure of how the ad hoc data are used on UMass campus and stored on UMass campus. At the University of So at the University of Washington, so as I'm sure you've discussed, there are all kinds of privacy considerations, things like this that are special to the ad hoc data. And so at the University of Washington, what happened was there was one big grant that applied for use of the ad hoc data, and it was within a center, the Center for Studies of Demography and Ecology at the University of Washington. And I believe what ended up happening is through that one big grant, other projects on campus were able to also gain access to the data. So every individual researcher didn't have to separately apply to use them. And the other nice thing that happened at the University of Washington was that there was an effort by people within at least one of these groups to do some data cleaning. And so there was some data cleaning, some cleaning up. I do network statistics, and so a lot of the work that I did had to do with the structures of the network, the ties variables within the ad hoc data. And a lot of the data that I got to use were somewhat cleaned by somebody else. And so I don't know if there's sufficient interest in ad hoc data at UMass that there might be interest in doing something like that, where some of these functions don't have to be duplicated for every individual user. But I certainly benefited from that. So, which both limits the amount of information I have about the raw data themselves, but then there were some parts of the cleaning that I was more aware of as they were going on. So, this is really so this is your data from one of the ad hoc schools. This is a Wave 1 school, and I worked exclusively with the Wave 1 data. I was interested in friendship networks within the schools, And once people have left school, those things, lose meaning in later waves, or they change meaning quite dramatically. So, I don't remember what school number this is. This is one of the schools, and you can see the shapes are genders and the colors of grades. And these are some slides from other presentations, and so you've probably heard about some of the friendship ties and the idea that everybody was asked to report up to 5 female friends and up to 5 male friends, and that forms the core of the network data in these data. One of the things that this example highlights is the missing data element of the ad hoc data. So I don't know if you talked about this.
Not yet, we're hoping you would.
Okay, so there are a fair amount of missing data in the ad hoc data in various ways, and this particular study, there were 89 students in the school. 70 of them reported their friendship information. Now, even that's an overstatement. There were actually more than 89 students in the school, but there were 89 students for whom we knew their sex and their grade. And I think there were maybe 103. We picked this school because it had some missing data. It had some missing data that we wanted to develop statistical methods to deal with. But there was still a substantial amount of data available. So this is actually one of the smaller schools and one of the smaller rates of missing data. So sex and grade for 89 students, friendships reported for 70 of the students. And then this particular methodological project was about making inference about the underlying network structure, the statistical properties of the underlying network structure, given that we haven't seen all of the edges of the network. So here's a plot of all the data that we got to see. Here's a plot of, there's this interesting asymmetry in network ties where you may not choose to be in the study, but somebody else may say that you're their friend. So this is all basically these are data about non-respondents. So you can see the arrows are directed, so those are directed friendship nominations. And the arrows go to people who did not report their own friendship ties. So we have this interesting structure where these are all ties that we observed, but not the people at the head end of the nose or of the arrows are not those that we observed. And this is what the network looks like if you just take those people out. So these are all the data we got to see. These are the ties to people who didn't respond about their friendships. And this is what the network looks like if you take them out. And so the point is that it looks somewhat different. So one of the questions that you face when you're working with these data is, what do I do with the fact that I know that I have partial data? And so we may be interested in some sort of a scientific question, like about friendships and hierarchy and egalitarian friendships. For those of you who've talked about the network with sensitivity and things like this, and methodologically we wanted to fit a network model that took into account the missing data structure. So basically the structure of the data we had was something like this. It's a little bit fast and also not the main point, but if you've seen a sociomatrix before, you can imagine this box as a sociomatrix. So we lined up all the people in the school this way. We put the respondents and then the non-respondents, and then the out ties of this individual go across this way. And so we get to observe all the ties within the respondents. We get to observe the ties from the respondents to the non-respondents, but we don't get to observe any ties from the non-respondents to anyone else. So usually when we're dealing with network data, we're just paying attention to this square. The square of, well, usually we have a square sociomatrix, and usually we assume that we've observed everything about everyone in the population. And in this case, is honestly, in most cases of network data, if we're honest with ourselves, there's some part of the data that we sort of observe incompletely, or there's some people at the boundary of what we get to observe who don't give us full information, and sometimes we just sort of pretend that they don't exist. And so the critical methodological question here is, are these data, these edge ties we don't observe in the gray, missing at random? So is the missingness status of these ties at all related to the distributions of those ties? And that's the question we ask ourselves in missing data in all contexts. And in this particular study, it was an application I won't belabor that, just to mention that there are many interesting dimensions in this data that can look at adult networks. And the other thing that I thought I'd illustrate from this example is we fit an exponential random graph. Actually, we fit an exponential random graph model. Has anybody seen exponential random graph models? They're kind of like logistic regression models. They're like logistic regression models, but they predict ties within networks, and they predict different structures of ties within networks. So if you imagine every tie is a 0 or a 1, either there's a tie or there isn't a tie, you can imagine modeling the whole network as a logistic regression. We get a little bit more complicated because we care about some structures that go beyond ties between pairs of people, like the triangle on the left is a transitive triad, the triangle on the right is a cyclical triad. If you think about it, the one on the left, it's indicative of some sort of a hierarchy in the friendship structure. So the nodes are sort of arrayed in this picture in a structure that represents the hierarchy, where if I say somebody is my friend, it's like I'm saying that they're really cool, very amazing, right? And so the one at the bottom thinks the one on the right is really amazing. The one on the right thinks the one at the top is really amazing. So the one at the bottom thinks so too. Yeah. So this, if we see lots of structures like this, we think that they might be suggestive of hierarchy in the relationships. If we see structures more like this is more indicative of egalitarian friendships in the underlying network. So we're friends, we're about equal. My friend is friends with somebody else, they're about equal. And so that other person is also friends with me, we're about equal. So if we look at the relative rates of seeing these kinds of triangles compared to what we would expect at random, we can get a sense of whether the tendency for friendships is more hierarchical or egalitarian. And so that's one of the things we look at in this network, and that's one of the cases where we go beyond the logistic regression model. We start caring in our exponential random graph models about something that's just a little bit more complicated than logistic regression, but you can still think of it that way in this 5-minute overview. That's not the central point of the talk. So, because a lot of you are probably social scientists, I want to talk about some of the features of these ties that we happen to look at in this model as we're trying to illustrate this this structural feature, this statistical feature. So we look at the overall rate of ties. We look at the tendency of students to reciprocate friendship nominations. So if I nominate you, you nominate me. It happens more often than at random, but not as often as you might think. That turns out. We looked at the rates of receiving ties by different grades, and also by different sexes. We looked at the rates of ties between girls and older boys, boys and older girls, girls and younger boys, and all the combinations thereof, and how those differences in grades might influence rates of ties. And then we looked within ties within the same sex and grade. We looked for the tendency for triangles to be transitive, for relationships to be more hierarchical versus cyclical and therefore egalitarian. And then finally, we determined the model for the propensity for students to receive no friendship ties above what we might expect at random. Turns out also happens a lot. And so we fit this model, and all of the terms that I described end up being significant in the model. So that's and so these. Our main goal in the study was actually to look at this. No, it's not this one. Was actually to look at seeing what we could do to look at the question of missingness at random, which I'm not going to highlight for the moment, but I just want to illustrate that with the friendship ties. These are some of the features. There's also race was the next logical variable to look at here. We did look at it. This school was fairly homogeneous, and so race didn't matter. Interesting. But, so, to give you a sense of what I've done with these data, so this is one project that I've used these data for. The other project I've used these data for test methods of inference for respondent-driven sampling that I've been developing. So a lot of my work has to do with the sampling methods called respondent-driven sampling, the network sampling method. One of the nice things for network researchers about the ad health data is that there's this set of, in theory, complete networks that we get to observe, and they have lots of characteristics of the individuals, and they're real, and they're at least an attempt to be a representative sample nationally, and that's really a nice body of networks on which to do research. Most network data are of a couple of different kinds. There's the very small networks, like the Karate Club network that some of the networks may have seen, and they're like 17 people in the network, and it's not necessarily like any other network in the universe, but it's an example that gets widely used. Or things like a crawl of Facebook, which is like, oh, how do people pick their Facebook friends? And I really just friended that person because I thought that, I met them at a party, and I didn't want them to feel bad that I rejected their request, but I don't even really remember who they are, and what does it really mean to have a Facebook friend, and then what does it mean to have this sample of Facebook that starts with somebody and then crawls out several waves. It's big, it's new, it's exciting, but its properties are really not well understood, and it doesn't necessarily represent something clearly. You have to work hard to figure out what it means practically and for your research. But at Health, it's like, this is a school. These are ties within the school, and people had an opportunity to name friends anywhere within the school. So it's actually a really rich and valuable network data set and set of data sets of real networks. So in that respect, we used it for this other project to simulate samples over the networks and then simulate making inference from those samples to understand how well our estimators worked on the samples. So here's this is an illustration, it's the same, you might notice, but so for this particular study, because we were trying to do sampling, we wanted to start with larger schools, because if we start with a school of size 100 and we draw a sample of size 500, that doesn't make any sense, right? So we looked at schools larger than 500 students because we were drawing samples of size 500. We also looked for schools in one building. I don't know if you talked about feeder schools. Yeah. So there's going to be a lot of different structure if you have a feeder school system rather than a one building. When you're thinking about the friendship data, there are nominations, and the out nominations are limited, the in nominations are not. And so sometimes if you're interested in more undirected network data, you have to think about how you're going to treat the non-directed, the directedness of the original data. So for this particular study, we just decided to neutralize the friendship. So if you nominated me, we're friends. Regardless of whether I nominated you. And then the other thing we looked at was a large connected component. So we didn't look at the isolates, or we didn't look at subgroups that were not connected to the large component. And this is because this is a methodological study. And then this leaves us, rather than with the whole population of networks, and then we draw samples and we estimate. The variable we looked at here was non-white, but there were several other variables we looked at too. And this leaves us with, 12 school communities that were larger than 500 and all in one building. And what we did in this case is we just drew simulated samples, we computed simulated estimators, we compared 5 different kinds of estimators, and we did that at each of these different schools. And so you can see the percentage is non-white. The truth is the horizontal bar. Black horizontal bar, and then the box plots are how well each estimator did, because the point of this study was to look at the performance of the estimators. But it also gives you a sense of various features of the different networks in the population. So the percent non-white in these schools, in this particular set of 12 larger schools, goes from about 10% up to about 95%. There's one school. This school had a population, so you can't quite see this, but I think that's in 1955 students in this We also record a couple of other features here, the rate of ties of whites versus non-white students, and the level of homophily on race. So some of these had, much higher homophily than others. So this one has a 2.2, and I'm just type in the scales right now, which is really interesting. That has an effect on the estimators. And so there's this range of networks. If you're interested in representative networks over the US population, it's as close as you can get for student networks. But then, if you're interested, like me, in the methodological issues on networks, it also gives you a range of school populations that you can look at and networks you can look at that have varying characteristics in different ways of show off properties of estimators, if that's what you're interested in, or other methods that you're, or other characteristics you're interested in studying. So I guess that's most of what I've done with these data. I was part of a working group at the University of Washington where there were and a number of colleagues who were doing other projects using these data. So it's possible that I've come across features other than the ones I've described in my own work. But that's mostly what I've done. So I guess I'll just take questions.
Yeah, let's, a few minutes for questions for Krista, and then, wrap up talking a little bit about accessing the data and sort of plans for follow-up. So, questions? Can you tell us whether you used the publicly available data?
This was the restricted data.
Restricted data.
Although has anybody used the publicly available data? You have both, okay, so you know what's in there. I thought there was some network data, but it was like a subset, and because of the way the subsample was done, it was kind of hard to
I also thought it was interesting that you said that there was a group that got the contract for the data at the University of Washington versus an individual. Because Tina, I thought you had looked into that a little bit and it wasn't clear.
Yeah, it was a little bit of because part of the application, I mentioned it on the final slide, but part of the application is you have to put an IRB protocol in there, so I don't know if an IRB, but if that would be true, that would say we'll just have this data for everyone.
Yeah, I think that the original project was quite broad. And I think that there were also additional IRB proposals that went in over time, and I think there was also, I don't know if this is still the case, but I think at the time there was also this requirement that there are all these requirements about what you can and can't save about the data over time. Like, I can keep a directory that's backed up of all of my code that works on the data, but I can't back up the directory that has the data. And all this data cleaning and rederivation of stuff, you're not supposed to save modified versions of the data. So that has to be in a non-backed up directory, and you have to save the code that does all the data cleaning, so that at a moment's notice, the data would have disappeared, and then come back again. You could reapply all your data cleaning code and get a new set of the data that you could start working from. So keeping all those things clean and up to date is also a challenge. I assume that that's still the case.
I don't know about all of them.
You have a question?
Yeah.
Tell us your name too.
Zeke.
Zeke.
So my question is regarding how the data actually gets stored on a computer.
Yeah.
So using some other federal data sets, there's typically restrictions in whether or not the computer can be connected to the network, whether or not peripheral devices can be connected to the computer, all that fun stuff. Is that the case here as well?
Yeah, so I think it can be connected to the network, but the data has to be stored in a particular directory. I can speak to when I used it, you can speak to when you used it. It's when I submitted my IRB supplement, I had to say which computer I was going to use it on, where that was geographically located, and at the University of Washington, the data actually reside on the on a central terminal server of the Center for Studies of Demography and Ecology. So whenever I was using the data, I had two logins. I still have two logins to their computers. One is my initialism AH for Ad Health, and the other I use for everything else. So in my AH account, I can access the Ad Health data. In my non-AH account, I can't. I can still access my personal directory structure, but the AH directory structure is only accessible to AH accounts. And I think you can also use it on your own computer with restrictions as well. But I mean, I was able to, be connected to the internet, but the Ad Health data were not allowed to be transferred off of the server to something else ultimately.
There are different contracts, so more sensitive data like the mental partner data from adolescents, as well as I think some of the HIV data, you would have to have a standard computer that's not connected to that time. They increased the accessibility of the data to servers. So that is a possibility to have a distributed server. I personally haven't done that because to do that, I didn't have a standard machine that I take colleagues who are working on it, just have one to hire people to handle the contract. Just do it that way.
So I'm just looking at the website right now, and it does have like a bunch of ways that you can store the data, on an external hard drive or on a computer that's connected to a network on a server, etc. And it has security plans that tells you like how to actually control access to the data. So the website is amazing; it just has so much information on it, but that is on there. So yeah, so it looks like it's possible, but you do have to have certain steps.
I know you want to use one way, but do either of you know anything about the missingness over time and problems? And has anybody done? I'm sure some people have done work on that. But sort of how to use the data set in that way in longitudinal designs.
So I think those things gets worse over time.
Yes.
Attrition rate was
Yeah.
for sure.
Do you know what the attrition rates are like?
They're not terrible.
No.
So it's like 15%, 20%. Wave, I think Wave 3 is going to restart because Wave 2 was a specific instance of technology. Grades 7 to 11 of the original sample. They wanted to keep it as a school sample, since they were the seniors in college or high school. So Wave 3 is the attempt to contact all the initial respondents. So Wave 2 and Wave 3 have that 50% attrition. Wave 4, I don't recall, that is also just before Wave 4 to Wave 3.
Other questions for Krista or Tony? And I think Tina's going to go back and sort of wrap up and talk about accessing the data a little bit. Then find out if there's interest in continuing.
Alright, so I believe you asked earlier about what's in which waves, and I actually just looked that up. So if you go to their website, they have an events button, and you can search for the past events. The users conference that I went to in June is on there, and they do have all the presentations from their official Ad Health presentations up there. So pulling up their general introduction. So here we've got the conference website, and they've got methodology online. And pulling up the overview that they had, there's this particular slide that says what was added and what was not. So looks that waves 1 and 2 were very similar, or exactly the same. In the waves 3, they added some other variables in particular, so you can see that it's right in the middle, so I don't know. But yeah.
So it looks like, for instance, if you were interested in parenting, they just started asking that information when the kids were old enough to potentially be parents, right? And that would be in wave 3 and 4. So you'd have 2 data points on parenting or something. Looks like cognitive function is only in the last grade.
Yep.
That's interesting. Do you know what the cognitive function is?
Yeah, I looked at that because I'm in cognitive psychology. So I was particularly looking at memory measures since that's what I study. But they did quite a few, like things like so recall, and I want to say things about like a digit span kind of working memory tasks. So they did have some cognitive tasks, like quite a few actually.
And that looks like that would only be in the last grade.
Yeah, that was just a way forward.
So the question about what you can look at longitudinally is going to vary by.
So just to go through my final slides here. Alright, so how can AdHealth be accessed? So, right, so I did already show you basically the Carolina Population Center website, which the link is in the handout. You can also easily Google Carolina Population Center and it'll pop up. But the data, the public use data, are located on another website, which is the Interdisciplinary Consortium for Political and Social Science, Social Research site. So got a link there as well on the handout. But I did want to just show you what that looks like. So you can find the public use data through the Carolina Population Center website. So they've got stuff about public use data, sort of describing it, and then the link here is where you can actually download the public use data. So anyone can download the public use data, and it takes you to the ICPSR website. So you can also go to the ICPSR website directly and just search here for analyze data for AdHealth, and it'll pop up as the first option here. And this is the public use data. Yeah.
So the public use data, is it a subset of the observations, respondents, or is it a subset of variables?
It's a subset of respondents. So let me go ahead and just go through that. What I have here. So the public use data was, they wanted to make the data available to the public, but because they do have neighborhood information, a lot of context, that they wanted to reduce the identifiability of that. So it's a smaller subset. It's around 6,000 participants in this data set, which is, and it doesn't include everything. So there's some things that they didn't want to have because, again, for security reasons and confidentiality and all that stuff. But the restricted use data is the full data set. So that includes, so the 20,000 is actually those who also have an in-home review, but it includes all the participants. And just as a heads up, it does require that contract, which you do have to apply for, and there is an $850 processing fee for that initial contract. You can renew it, I believe, for the restricted use, it's once every 3 years, and that doesn't cost anything to renew it. But there is that upfront fee. And basically, the time between when you submit an application and when you actually get access to the data, assuming everything is approved, takes about 6 weeks. So if you're thinking of trying to get that data, make sure that you plan the time for that application process.
It's actually going to take longer. Because the contract has specific language that pertains to state law, and so Massachusetts state law doesn't quite mesh with the contract, so the contract has to be modified, which means that our people here, administrators, have to go to communication with Carolina Population Center, with the lawyers there, and they have to agree on language that's consistent with all states.
They advertise this.
So when you're getting the data, do you have to be proposing exactly what your question is going to be and what you're doing, or can you basically get it and play?
I mean, I would say when I wrote the contract and also the IRB, very general.
Right.
So
Okay.
I mean, I'm sure the language.
I want to study the
Yeah.
When you wrote that contract, you said you were saying $850 processing fee, but then you talked about $1,000 to add a variable. Was that sort of like a penalty? I mean,
That's for the geocode data.
that was
So if you want to,
if you had originally requested that, would you also have paid $1,000, or was it because you added it on? I guess that's my question.
So yeah, it's just that's the processing fee for the restricted data. If you actually want to add your own variables to the data, that will cost money.
You mean to the data collection?
So when they go and collect data the next time, your question
Is that what you mean?
gets put on.
No.
So when you want the data that they've already collected, that's $850 initially. But let's say you have the data and you say, I have another variable that I want to include, I want to add it onto the existing data. You can go to the Carolina Population Center, or I guess you can pay even more to have them do it for you to add on that variable to the restricted use data. And that's the
So, okay, so this is the question. The restricted use data is a subset of all the possible variables that's already determined? That's my, or is it, I need these 5 variables and they pull those 5 variables?
That's a great question. So actually, when you go into the contract, you can check off about 30 boxes, and that is your data code. So there's there's sort of a standard restricted version which has a whole bunch of things, but not everything. And then there's what I call the super restricted data. That's where you have standalone data that has no access and 6,000 passwords. So those require additional justifications for getting them. So sometimes I don't bother checking them because I don't want to deal with like justification for that data. But generally, yeah, it's good to get as much as you can.
But if you needed more than 30 variables for some reason,
You'll get
you add on, you pay an extra fee.
no, the restricted one will come with like 1,000 variables. But if you want like HIV data or something really sensitive data, it's you can check off the box. You have to have a justification. It still costs $850. It's still about like the justification.
So is there a way for centers, like you were saying, if center had a data, like a center could have a data set and let people, how does that work?
You know, so you were added on as a user to the center.
So I was added on as a grad student actually, on a research project that had data. And I think, I don't know whether that project has just been renewed enough times that, and enough people have become sort of collaborators of that project, that they become users of it. I could try to ask, if this is something that folks are interested in.
Well, I think what we're thinking is we might want to see if CERF can apply for the data and house it, and then how do we get faculty and or students to get added onto that contract? Yeah.
I was at Ohio State, and they had a setup like that. I don't know which institution it was from. It was either through the sociology department, but it might have been through the Institute for Population Research. But yeah, basically the center had an IRB and they had the data, and it was on a server. And to get access to it as like a grad student or a faculty member, all you had to do was they would add you onto the IRB and to the contract and some forms, and then like a couple of weeks later, you can access that server. And so like it was the same kind of security setup where you can't use the data, you can't use it there, having access to the server. But so like I said, I don't know the exact details of how they set it up, but definitely know of people who would know that it was possible.
Yeah.
You said I basically did an ad hoc system that wasn't even like that, which was I had 15 faculty members on my IRB, those are my grad students, and each time I would just have to have them sign the pledges and send them on to ICSR at the time, and then publish and so on. So it's definitely possible to do it that way.
I think it's something that we'll want to look into. For sure.
It does seem that once you have access to the data, just adding collaborators is relatively easy.
The key will be whether it has to be on a server versus if it could be just housed on a computer.
You can. It looks like you can. I don't know for sure.
Yeah,
but it
so
looks
that we'll
like
have to,
you can.
because we don't have a server, a dedicated server. Figure out.
Yeah, I guess you have that here. At one point, I was considering trying to get access here for myself and graduate students. And I did talk with the people in OIT, and they were willing to talk with me and work with me and try to figure something out, but it just seemed more complicated than what I wanted to do as an individual researcher. But, I mean, we have this really
that'll be our kind of homework.
Forgot about that.
Yeah, I didn't want to shift the conversation away from the access part, but it was more about the super restricted data. One thing I've seen in published studies, and this is Chandra Mahler and her students out of Texas, and I've seen a lot of studies using transcript data. Is that available, or is that something that maybe she and her team have done? I know she's a sociologist, right? I'm curious to know about that as well. So transcript data, we have that. And also, what else besides HIV? We have a map here of the sampling structure. For example, are these genetic subsamples and data, for example, are those in this, inner sanctum sanctorum of super restricted data, or what else is in there besides HIV?
The educational transcript data is available. I don't remember if it's I think that necessarily defaults you to having a standard workstation situation.
Oh.
I think I requested it. And I'm running the standard situation.
Is this something that her group created and then later they absorbed?
I
Absolutely.
constructed it, but I don't remember who actually constructed it, but everyone can access that data.
Okay.
And that would be grades, saying.
Well, yeah, not the self-report grades, right? The grades. God, what classes you took. That
Classes there.
So for people in educational research or if they're interested in achievement, that would be interesting.
yeah. The other point was what is super secret stuff other than HIV? What else do we have to work extra hard for?
But I think there's, I'm looking at here, the visual is the data sets that are there. Shown in the contract. So they with all the biometric data.
So there's a description of the restricted.
That's the way to look into Paris contracts which I had for a year because I went back to stand after because it was just too much documentation required to have to read it every year and stuff.
Yeah, so it is a separate contract for the
Yes.
So you can basically tell us if there's another PDF you have to fill out. It's more for you. More samples.
Looks like biomarkers are glucose, lipids.
We also have
They had these diagnoses too somewhere, the one you were showing about the diabetes diagnoses, that's probably not in the restricted, it's just basic physical health.
So this is like the checklist.
So of course, the next step would be you have to go to the website now that you know it is and really look at it and figure out what kinds of information you would want to ask for.
There's so much.
And they
So I don't want to be like sensitive to time restriction. So we basically covered all this information. So there's public use data, restricted use data, and romantic data data like a separate application that's more stringent. So only one person can access the data. It's not like you can have 5 person can access the data. I've already showed you the website, but I did want to just sort of talk about how Center for Research on Campus can help you if you are interested in using AdHelp. So you can definitely contact me or contact Aileen, who's the director of the methodology branch. Can contact just the center generally, look at our website. But we are interested in seeing whether or not you guys are interested in a users group. So if you are looking to use this data, we could meet regularly to talk about any issues that you're facing or any questions that you might have about using the data. We could work together and synergistically combine our efforts. So I guess I don't know if you guys know at this point whether or not that's something of interest or I want to see the interest. Gauge that.
I mean, yeah, go ahead. Sorry. I think your hand was big. Well, I mean, one thing we could do is, SURF can facilitate like a first meeting of a user group. And what we can do is send out an email and pick a date and say we're going to have this first meeting. And in the meantime, we'll be figuring out whether we can get a contract for the data. So that, and if you come to the user group, probably the idea would be that you're interested yourself in applying for a contract or for having some ideas about at least exploring it more at that point.
And in the meantime, you can always access the public use data set. You do need to create like a login for the nice PSR and like create that. You're going to use it for certain purposes, but otherwise you can access it and there's plenty of stuff there to like sort of look at 10,000 variables to sort through. So in the meantime, you can be exploring that. All right. So I guess that's
Any general comments or questions before we?
So our small group is from Tufts, and we found out about your presentation by email. Would we be able to collaborate, or is it only a UMass?
You mean come to the users group?
Yeah.
Oh, we would be happy to have you come out.
Oh,
to the
okay,
users
so it's
group.
not just
No.
limited to the university?
No, I mean, when we first announced this, I think we sent out a pretty broad email because we have, we have a list of people who have attended anything that SURF has done over the last few years. If you've come to a talk, if you've come to any of our courses, if you've come to any of the workshops, your name gets on our email distribution list. And we have a regional list. And I don't know, Carla, I'm sorry, did you send this out to the regional list?
I just sent it out to the methodology list.
To the methodology.
So that is where it gets, because of the workshops, we had people from all over
Right.
with ICSR.
So the answer is yes, we would welcome having you. It's not likely though that we'd have our meetings in Boston, but we'd probably be out here, but we would be out
either.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
Another question is, so if we don't get access to the restricted data, I'm a little bit confused about the public data sets. Are they okay to use as a research question, or are they so non-representative?
Well, that's the question. Who are the 6,000 students sitting in
Created
that?
already for you, or do you have to apply weights?
So there are files that have weights already, and they're like documentation of which weights to use in which situations, which is excellent. But that's already sort of, they prepared that for you. But in terms of how representative it is, I don't know. Like that might be something that you sort of have to decide whether or not your field would be okay with. It's sort of representative, or I don't know. I can't really answer.
The nice thing is, you could go home tonight and download public use and look at it and see what kinds of information is in it to start to get an idea about whether the kinds of questions you're interested in could be answered with that, or whether you would need to move to having a contract for the more restricted data set.
For a grain of salt, I know someone who actually, my brother actually looked at the public use data, and I think his complaint about it was not that it wasn't person representative, but I don't think it included those over samples. He wanted to compare ethnic groups. So I think that's where he ran into trouble with the public use data. But he didn't complain about representation.
So it's something to, I think that's what you find out when you go to the public use and you look at the documentation. It tells you what's in there. But if you're not at all familiar with that help, it's probably a very good way to get started, seeing what's in the data set, and then you need to think about whether you would need a contract for the restricted use. I guess most people find that's a little bit of work, but if that's what your questions are, you need that information. Any other questions? Thank you for coming. Please take coffee and cookies. There's still some left on the way out. So we will be back in touch to let you know when we're going to. We'll use this email list as a starting point, and then if you have other collaborators or know of others who might be interested, you can let them know about it once we send out the email list. Thank you, Krista, and Tina, and Tanya.